Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the January edition of the Civil War Museum's Second Friday Lecture Series. With us today is Dr. James Pula. We're very excited to have him with us this afternoon. For those of you just joining us on Facebook, as you know, since last April, we've gone to the Facebook virtual platform to host our Second Friday Lecture Series, and for the foreseeable future, I think well into 2021, this will be the platform in which we will still broadcast these programs to you. We're excited about the possibilities of bringing live and in-person programs back to the museums, to the Civil War Museum later this year. But I think we'll continue our commitment to broadcasting them via Zoom. We've had tremendous response from all over the country and all over the world, people tuning in to watching these programs. I want to mention today too, our continued thanks to the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable and Iron Brigade Association for being the title sponsor of our Second Friday Lecture program. Whether we're virtual or in person, their support is extremely important to us, and we continue to thank them for thinking of us and supporting our museum and our educational mission. As I mentioned, today we have Dr. James Pula to do his program on the Sigel Regiment. Dr. Pula is a professor of history at Purdue University Northwest, and he's also editor of Gettysburg magazine. He's the author of numerous books, including The Sigel Regiment, A History of the 26th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, and Under the Crescent Moon with the 9th Corps in the Civil War. His work has been honored with the Hyman Award for sustained scholarly contributions to the Polish-American history and culture, the Distinguished Service Award from the American Council for Polish Culture, 3 Oscar Halecki Prizes for various books, and the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, among others. As I mentioned, Dr. Pula's program for us today is entitled Wisconsin Sigel Regiment and the Civil War. Dr. Pula, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who's tuning in. I appreciate your interest in the Sigel Regiment. So since we have a limited topic for today, in August of 1862, President Lincoln called for 300,000 more volunteers after the tremendous losses during the Peninsular Campaign and Jackson's Valley Campaign and so forth. Among them was the 26th Wisconsin, or what would become the 26th Wisconsin. The soldiers called themselves the Sigel Regiment after Franz Sigel, who was a very popular German-American leader at the time, had been a leader in the German revolutions in 1848. The colonel was William Jacobs. Jacobs, like most of the officers, was born in Germany. He had become a very successful banker in Milwaukee, sang in the Sangerbund, the local German choir, and had been elected as a clerk in the Circuit of County Courts. So he was a rather prominent Milwaukeean in a city that had a very large German population and elected quite a few Germans to public office. Here's a picture of their initial flag, the 1862 version, which was later traded in for another one that I'll show you later. I always like to try to personalize presentations a little bit, so I thought I would tell you a little bit about a half dozen of the people who signed up, why they signed up, and then at the end of the presentation, perhaps go back and let you know what happened to them. Bernhard Domschcke was an interesting character. He was a partner of the radical German Karl Heinzen in authoring what was called the Louisville Platform. It was an attempt to form a German-American political party in the United States based on principles such as opposition to slavery, support for women's voting rights, and other issues that were deemed to be radical in that particular day. When the war broke out, he was the editor of a radical German newspaper in Milwaukee. He closed his offices and with the entire staff marched down to the recruiting station and signed up. Karl Dörflinger was from Germany. He was studying to be an architect. He was an apprentice when the war broke out. And like some people, he signed on as a recruiting agent to recruit other people, and soon joined up himself for reasons of what he called patriotic sentiment. Karl Vickesburg was a carpenter in Herman, Wisconsin. He had just been ditched by his girlfriend and was feeling kind of low, so he decided in order to escape the immediate environment, he would sign up because of his lost love affair. Albert Wallber was born in Berlin. Wallber was a clerk in Milwaukee and a prominent member of the local Turnverein, the German gymnastic club. When the Turnverein voted that all able-bodied men should sign up, Wallber marched down to the recruiting office with them and signed up alongside his comrades. Adam Muenzenberger was a cobbler in Greenfield, Wisconsin, the father of four. His local Catholic church was in need of money. It apparently was on the verge of bankruptcy, and soldiers were being paid the equivalent of about a third to a half year's salary for signing up as a bonus. So Muenzenberger signed up to get the bonus, which he then donated to his local Catholic church. And Franz Lackner was actually born in Detroit, of German parentage. He was a law student when the war began, was a recruiting agent, had no intention at all of signing up himself, but one after another of the recruiting agents signed up, and eventually he did so himself, probably from what we would call today peer pressure. He wrote that he had no intention of signing up, but felt that there was no honorable way he could get out of doing so, so he did. The regiment was sent east, and it was assigned to the 11th Corps under General Franz Sigel. By and large, the troops could not have been happier because they would be serving under the command of the person who they chose as the name of their regiment, Franz Sigel. They were delighted to find out that they were assigned to the division led by Karl Schurz, another prominent German-American leader who had been active in Wisconsin and was well known to almost everyone. And their brigade commander was Colonel Władimir Krzyżanowski, a Polish exile from one of the revolutions against Russia. So they all had revolutionary backgrounds in common. They arrived in over the winter of 1862-63 in Washington, D.C., and in April of '63, President Lincoln reviewed the Army. Captain Frederick Winkler wrote that Father Abraham is notoriously not a handsome man, but there is that in his looks which says that he is not a common man. By this time, the Army was under the command of Joseph Hooker, who had a reputation for being aggressive and who made a lot of reforms in the Army, including getting rid of the so-called band divisions, where a major general actually commanded 2 Army Corps. One of the people who was unhappy about this was Franz Sigel, who believed that he was being demoted. Sigel resigned and was replaced by Oliver Otis Howard. So Howard would be the 11th Corps commander during the first portion of the enlistment of the 26th Wisconsin. The first campaign, unfortunately for them, would be Chancellorsville. At the beginning of April 1863, the situation looked something like this, with Hooker and Lee facing each other across the Rappahannock River. Hooker decided to divide his army in 2, try to move down the Rappahannock, cross behind Lee, and catch his army in a vise between the 2 portions of the Army of the Potomac. He wrote, "My plans are perfect. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." Situation looks something like this on April 27th, when the campaign begins, with 3 of the Army Corps marching toward Hartwich Church, which they reach on April 28th. They then cross the Rappahannock, spend the night. On April 30th, they cross the Rapidan River, arriving at the small crossroads of Chancellorsville, which General Howard described as trees all entangled with a thick, almost impenetrable undergrowth, and crisscrossed with an abundance of wild vines. In places, the forest appeared impassable. This was a very rough, dense terrain, much more so than you would usually pick to fight a battle. On the night of May 1-2, the situation looked something like this, with Hooker's headquarters at the small Chancellor House, fronted by Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps, the 11th Corps making up the far right of the Union Army. During the night, Lee allowed Stonewall Jackson to propose a movement where he would take about half of the Confederate Army, march west and then south. Once behind the cover of the trees, they would then turn west again, using country lanes to move beyond the right flank of the Union Army, where they could hopefully outflank the Union position and drive it in. On May 2, some of the scouts began to bring in word that Confederates were moving west. Schurz asked General Howard for permission to face some of his regiments to face west in case there was an attack on the flank. Howard refused. So Schurz, using his prerogative as a division commander, moved the 82nd Ohio back a little bit farther and took his 2 reserve regiments and placed them on the Hawkins Farm under Colonel Krzyzanowski facing west. So aside from the 2 regiments at the far end of the Union line, when the Confederate attack occurs, these 2 regiments, including the 26th Wisconsin, were the only ones facing the direction of the Confederate attack. By 5:30, when Jackson is ready to move, he has 33,000 Confederates about to attack end on 9,500 Federals, over a 3-to-1 advantage. Confederates are aligned something like this, with each of these being brigades. So you can see that the 11th Corps was in a very poor position to try to receive any Confederate attack. Early in the afternoon, or I should say late in the afternoon, the situation looked something like this. The Confederates begin their attack. At first, they're thrown back, but then because of the large numerical advantage, it's very easy for them to simply outflank the few Union regiments facing the direction of the attack. Some of the regiments attempted to turn, but they were outflanked in their turn. As the retreat began, it hampered the attempts of other regiments to reform, and they were caught in the flank as well. No matter how long or how wide the Union stretched their troops, the Confederates had such a numerical advantage that it was always possible for them to outflank the Federals. Looking north to where the 26th Wisconsin was, it faced considerable Confederate pressure, which at first drove back, but then eventually was outflanked on the north and on the south when 3 entire brigades attacked 3 Union regiments. They were obviously forced back, reformed behind the small creek to the right of your screen, where Carl Schurz attempted to form another line to hold back the Confederate advance. As you can see in the circle, the 26th Wisconsin held the far right of the Union line. Again, they drove back 2 attempts at Confederates to overwhelm them before they were eventually outflanked on both sides and once again forced to retreat. On the 5th of May, Hooker recrossed the Rappahannock River, moving his army back to safety. One of the people who viewed the fight of the 26th Wisconsin, and remember, this is the first engagement they had ever fought in, said the 26th Wisconsin stood in line 20 minutes, attacked by a largely superior number who had the advantage of a screening forest. They stood and fought unflinchingly until the enemy had largely doubled around their flanks, both right and left, They then were retired in good order. Their division commander had considerable praise. This young regiment, alone and unsupported, firmly held the ground where I had placed it for 20 minutes, nor did it fall back until I ordered it to do so. There is hardly an officer who has not had at least a bullet through his clothes. Had it not been for the praiseworthy firmness of these men, the enemy would have obtained possession of the woods opposite without resistance, taken the rifle pits from the rear, and appeared on the plank road before the artillery could have been withdrawn. The regiment carried 471 men into action. 53 were killed for a percentage of 11. Total number of casualties, 204, 43.3%. Of all the federal regiments that fought at Chancellorsville, the 26th Wisconsin suffered the 5th highest loss of any regiment in any corps. So clearly they did some serious fighting there. After Chancellorsville, Lee decides to invade the North, beginning the movement on June 3rd. Eventually, 10 days later, Hooker perceives what's going on and begins to move the Army of the Potomac north in chase. By the 16th, Lee reaches Harper's Ferry at a time when Hooker has reached Centreville, Virginia. You can see what an enormous head start the Confederates had on the Union Army. By June 27th, the 11th Corps was just crossing the Potomac River at the head of the Union advance, while all three of the major Confederate corps were already in Pennsylvania. The 26th Wisconsin followed the corps and camped in Emmitsburg, Maryland, just north of Emmitsburg on June 30th, the day before the Battle of Gettysburg begins. By this time, Colonel Jacobs had gone back to Milwaukee to recruit additional soldiers, and the command devolved on the Lieutenant Colonel Hans Beubel, who was a painter and a singer in the Milwaukee Sangerbund, and also an amateur actor. Early on the morning, Confederates outnumbered the Union First Corps and were beginning to threaten its flank when the 11th Corps arrives. Two of the divisions are sent north of town to protect the Union flank, while one is stationed on Cemetery Hill as a reserve and a fallback position. The 26th Wisconsin is still part of Chijanovsky's brigade, and initially it's held in reserve by General Schurz north of Gettysburg. As you can see, the Confederates greatly outnumber the Union once again. They're able to attack the forward Union elements on Blocker's Knoll, outflanking them on both the right and the left. In a similar situation to that the Corps found itself in at Chancellorsville. The Union troops begin to withdraw. Chijanovsky's brigade is sent in to try and reinforce them and to protect the withdrawal. It numbered 1,425 men, so it was outnumbered about 3-to-1, or 2-to-1 if you count only Dole's and Gordon's brigade. Once again, it's attacked and outflanked on both sides and driven back. The 26th Wisconsin rallied at the Adams County Almshouse along with several other regiments, only to be outflanked once again and forced to retreat back toward town. One of the Confederates who attacked wrote in a letter home, "The Yankees stopped and made a desperate stand. Their officers were cheering their men and behaving like heroes and commanders of the First Water." Howard sends a brigade forward to try and help cover the retreat of the Corps back to Cemetery Hill. Part of this is Heckman's brigade, or Heckman's battery rather, Battery K, 1st Ohio Light Artillery. 26th Wisconsin rallies behind the battery to provide infantry support. And once again, they're attacked by superior numbers, outflanked, and driven back. 26th Wisconsin retires directly through the town of Gettysburg, through the main square, where it acts as a rear guard protecting the withdrawal of the artillery. One of the physicians, the chief physician in the 26th, was Dr. Franz Huebschmann. He had a medical degree from the University of Jena in Germany, founded the Wisconsin Banner, a German newspaper, was a prominent political leader. He had actually been served as a presidential elector in the recent election of 1860. Huebschmann was in a field hospital in Gettysburg when Confederate troops arrived. Bullets began to come through the windows. He became outraged because they were trying to tend to wounded soldiers inside. So Huebschmann walked out into the middle of the road with bullets flying, waved his arms, and yelled to the Confederates that they were attacking a hospital. Go find somebody armed to shoot at. The firing stopped. As Confederates began to drive in the First Corps, it began to retreat through Gettysburg as well. Some of the units of the First Corps became entangled with units of the 11th in this area here in the circle, and some confusion resulted, which accounts for a lot of the letters you read that say that there was a confused retreat. Most of the 11th Corps retreated straight through Gettysburg to Cemetery Hill. Here you see a picture from Cemetery Hill looking toward the town. The 11th Corps and the 26th Wisconsin retreated in this direction, the 26th going into line behind this small stone fence about halfway up Cemetery Hill. So on July 1st, the regiment had marched 13 miles from Emmitsburg to Gettysburg through heat and humidity, a rainstorm along the way, followed by more humidity. They fought well in a rather impossible position north of town. They rallied at the Almshouse line. They supported Heckman's battery north of Gettysburg, and then they covered the retreat and rallied on Cemetery Hill. They brought 558 men into the conflict. 61 were killed for an average of 13%. Aggregate casualties, 252. 55% of everyone serving with the regiment at Gettysburg was either killed, wounded, or captured, including the regimental commander who lost a leg. Of all the Union regiments in any corps serving at Gettysburg, this was the 15th highest loss of any federal regiment. After Gettysburg, the regiment moved into northern Virginia with the 11th Corps and the Army of the Potomac as they began to chase the Confederates. Eventually, a stalemate emerged. Confederates in the West surrounded Chattanooga in an attempt to force the surrender of the Union Army there to, in some way, offset losses they had sustained at Gettysburg. In order to help relieve the siege of Chattanooga, the War Department ordered General Ulysses S. Grant to combine several of the forces in the West to relieve the siege, and to assist, they ordered General Meade to send 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac to help in the process. Meade selected the 11th and 12th Corps, the 2 most recent additions to the Army of the Potomac. So in September, the 11th Corps was withdrawn to Washington and then sent by rail roughly along this route through Ohio, Indiana, south through Kentucky and Tennessee to Bridgeport, Alabama. In 2 weeks, 2 entire Army Corps, with all of their baggage, equipment, artillery, horses, and everything else, were moved over this entire route, which was the largest, most successful movement by rail in any war up to that time. Union forces were besieged in Chattanooga. the 11th Corps arrives at Bridgeport and begins to follow the railroad line toward Chattanooga to try and relieve the siege. Along the way, Confederates who had been moved west from Lee's army to assist in the siege under General James Longstreet met the 11th Corps at Wauhatchie, were defeated, and the Corps moved north of Chattanooga, where it participated in the attack on Missionary Ridge, breaking the Confederate siege of Chattanooga. After Chattanooga, General Burnside had an army in Knoxville. Longstreet began to retire back to Virginia, and along the way he laid siege to Knoxville, attempting to force the surrender of Burnside's army. So in December of 1863, the 11th Corps was one of the units detached from Grant's army under the command of General William Tecumseh Sherman to try and relieve the siege of Knoxville. In mid-December, through cold and freezing rain and ice storms, they marched to within a few miles of Knoxville when Longstreet finally gave up the siege after finding out that they were on the way to relieve Burnside. At that point, they turned around and marched back to Knoxville. One of the soldiers said the hardships of the campaign had been extraordinary. The men were mostly without blankets, shoes, were badly worn out, and on the way back, quite a number were absolutely barefoot. When you read the letters and diaries of some of the soldiers, some of them were barefoot, and they wrapped clothing around their feet to try and keep them from freezing. Some of the cows that they ran into along the way were slaughtered, and their skins were wrapped around the feet, even though they hadn't been cured, hopefully to last another day and prevent frostbite. By this time, Colonel Jacobs had resigned, and he was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Winkler. Winkler had been an attorney, admitted to the bar in Milwaukee in 1859, and had risen from his original rank of captain. In early 1864, with their original banner quite in tatters, the regiment received a new banner, somewhat different design, and it had stitched on it the engagements the regiment had been involved in up to that time: Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Wauhatchie, and Mission Ridge. Beginning of 1864, the 11th and 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac, both of which were seriously under strength, were merged into one unit and redesignated the 20th Corps. The 26th Wisconsin was merged along with the rest of the 11th Corps into this new unit and took part under General Sherman in his march toward Atlanta. The first engagement they were involved in was at Buzzard Roost Gap. At Rocky Face Ridge, they were part of an attack which captured a line of Confederate entrenchments. During this entire campaign, Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate forces, his strategy was to take up a position and try and force Sherman to attack him to the Confederates' advantage. Sherman, being too smart to do that, always attempted to outflank Johnston and drive him back. So there was a whole series of small engagements, small to moderate-sized engagements, as Sherman attempted one flanking move after another, forcing Johnston to retreat. The next one was at Resaca, where the 26th captured Confederate rifle pits and also a battery of 2 Confederate artillery pieces. It then fought briefly at Cassville, at Burnt Hickory, at Dallas, where it again assaulted and captured a line of Confederate entrenchments, at New Hope Church, Pine Mountain, Golgotha Church, and Lost Mountain. And each of these the Union forces were outflanking Johnston, forcing him back, and gradually, as you can see, making their way toward Atlanta, which is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. As they approached Atlanta, they fought at Muddy Creek, where one of the 26th Wisconsin soldiers captured an unidentified flag from a Confederate regiment. Unidentified in that these soldiers they took it from were dead, so no one knew really what regiment it had been. They fought at Noses Creek, at Kenosha Mountain, at Kolb's Farm, where they captured another set of Confederate entrenchments, and then getting very close to Atlanta, in what today are really the Atlanta suburbs, they fought at Peachtree Creek. At this point, Johnston had been relieved by Jefferson Davis and replaced by John Bell Hood, who immediately launched an attack on the Union forces, attempting to drive them back. At Peachtree Creek, the Union forces had just crossed the stream, the 26th Wisconsin being held in reserve and Wood's Brigade, and they faced a force of Confederates that Hood led in the attack. They drove back the corps next to them, and along with it, part of Wood's Brigade. The 33rd Mississippi rushed into the gap to outflank Wood's Brigade and drive it back as well, at which point the 26th Wisconsin, as the reserve was sent in, attacked the Confederates, drove them back, and then held the position against a counterattack by the rest of Featherston's Confederate brigade. Colonel Wool, their brigade commander, wrote, "Coolly and deliberately the men poured into their line a well-directed, withering, and destructive fire, which covered the ground with dead and wounded. To us it was a brilliant feat of arms. We encountered the enemy in superior numbers in an open field. We met his offensive attack with an offensive return, his charge with a countercharge. The victory was complete and decisive." Frederick Bierstadt wrote in his diary, "This morning," this is the day after the fight, "this morning our regiment, after a sleepless night, had to bury the dead Rebs which laid before our regiment. They were all from the 33rd Mississippi Regiment. Our regiment lost 9 dead and 36 wounded. We buried over 50 Rebs, among them Colonel Drake and most of the officers." Here's a picture of the Confederate regimental colors. They were captured by the 26th Wisconsin, as you can see written here on the banner, captured by 26th Wisconsin volunteers. The person given credit for capturing them was Captain John Fuchs. The brigade commander wrote, "I cannot discharge," this is in his official report, "my whole duty in this report without pointing out for a special commendation the conduct of the 26th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry and its brave and able commander. The position of this regiment in the line was such that the brunt of the attack fell upon it. The brave, skillful, and determined manner in which it met this attack rolled back the onset, pressed forward in a countercharge, and drove back the enemy, excelled by the troops in this or any other army, and is worthy of the highest commendation and praise." Here's an interesting painting that was painted by one of the veterans of the regiment following the war, showing the 26th in the bottom going through the woods into position to make its counterattack. The regiment was one of the first to enter Atlanta, and it also took part in Sherman's march to the sea, helping to destroy part of the Georgia Railroad. It moved on to what was then the Georgia state capital, occupying Milledgeville, continued toward the coast, destroying the Georgia Central Railroad, then the Augusta and Savannah Railroad, and eventually ending up at Savannah, Georgia, on the Atlantic coast. From the Atlantic coast, it followed Sherman's army into the Carolinas, being present at the capture of Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. Then it moved north into North Carolina, where it participated in the Battle of Avery'sboro, and a few days later, the Battle of Bentonville, and was present, or at least in the general locality, of the surrender of General Joseph Johnston's army on April 26 to Sherman, effectively ending the Civil War in the East. If you look at its battle honors, you can see that the 26th Wisconsin was deeply engaged both in the East and in the West. General William Cogswell, under whom it served during Sherman's march through the Carolinas, wrote that it was one of the finest military organizations in the service. Edwin Bryant of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion, after the war, wrote that in the roll of Wisconsin's regiments, none are more deserving, none have more glorious record than this regiment. William Fox, whose regimental losses in the American Civil War is a standard reference for all Civil War historians, wrote that it was a German regiment whose gallantry and soldierly bearing reflected credit upon its nationality. Of every Wisconsin soldier who went off to war, 1 out of every 7 was either killed or died of wounds or died from disease. In the 26th Wisconsin, it was 1 out of every 4. Total casualties for the regiment, killed, wounded, missing, captured, 617, which was 56.7% of all the men enlisted throughout the war in the regiment. If you eliminated about 100 recruits who showed up at the end of the war and really participated in none of the battles, then its actual casualty rate was about 63%. 189 were killed and wounded, which accounted for 17.2% of the regiment who died either outright or as a result of wounds they suffered. I'm often asked, well, why wasn't it in the Iron Brigade? Well, it wasn't in the Iron Brigade because that was enlisted in 1861 primarily. The 26th Wisconsin was enlisted in the fall of 1862. So by that time, the Iron Brigade was already well established. During the war, the Iron Brigade lost 15% killed and died of wounds. The 26th Wisconsin lost 17.2. So it certainly took a backseat to no one. Again, in Fox's regimental history, Fox found that of all the literally thousands of federal regiments who served during the Civil War, the 26th Wisconsin ranked 5th in the percentage of enrolled who were killed or died of wounded. 5th out of thousands of regiments. Here's a picture of some of the veterans at the dedication of their regimental memorial in Gettysburg. This was on July 1st, 1888, when they had a regimental reunion there. Here's a picture of a regimental reunion on the 50th anniversary of their mustering in August of 1862. So let's get back for a minute to the people we talked about at the beginning. Franz Lackner was the person who never wanted to go, only joined up really because of peer pressure. Lackner eventually rose to the rank of major, and at the time the regiment mustered out, Lackner was second in command of the regiment. Not bad for someone who never intended to enlist in the first place. Karl Dörflinger, enlisted as a lieutenant, was shot in the ankle at Chancellorsville, underwent 3 separate amputations of the leg to save his life. He went back to Wisconsin and opened the Dörflinger Artificial Limb Company to construct artificial limbs for other Union veterans who had lost arms and legs during the war. Bernhard Domschcke, the editor who closed his newspaper office and marched off to war, was surrounded in Gettysburg in a famous incident where Union troops were surrounded in one of the hotels there and forced to surrender later that evening. Domschcke was taken off to Libby Prison, survived the ordeal, and later wrote an important memoir of what it was like to be in a Confederate prison. Albert Wallber was knocked unconscious by an artillery shell explosion north of Gettysburg, captured, hauled off to Libby Prison as well. And Wallber was one of over 100 Union soldiers who eventually dug tunnels into the streets surrounding Libby and staged a successful escape. Wallber was one of the few who actually made it back to federal lines, and he also left a memoir of his stay in Libby Prison. Karl Vickesburg, who joined the regiment to escape a failed love affair, was shot through the chest at Resaca and died that evening in a federal field hospital. And Adam Muenzenberger, who enlisted so that he could give his bounty to the local church and save it from bankruptcy, was also captured along with Domschcke at Gettysburg, sent to the Belle Isle prison in Richmond, and died of disease there in December without ever making it home. So I think you'll agree that 26th Wisconsin certainly was in the thick of much of the fighting at some of the larger battles in 1863 at Gettysburg and Chancellorsville. It was in the thick of the fighting at Chattanooga, and later very successfully made its way with Sherman's army to Atlanta, then on the march to the sea, and finally in pursuit of Joseph Johnston's army in North Carolina. In every one of its engagements, it was cited by superior officers for its gallantry in action and for its steadfastness in the fight. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and if anyone has any questions, you can email them to Doug, and I'll be happy to try and answer them. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I appreciate it. And Doug, thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. Do you have time for just a couple of questions that popped into my head that maybe others would have kind of preemptively here? Just two that I thought
Sure,
of.
I'd be glad to.
How was the 26th Wisconsin and the 11th Corps after Chancellorsville and Gettysburg? They were blamed largely for that, and I think you've proven today, unfoundedly. How were they received when they got to the West, to Chattanooga, by the other Western Theater Union troops? Were they welcomed with open arms? Were there any accounts that people kind of doubted whether they would fight?
Yeah.
How were they received by those other Union troops?
Well, that's interesting. As you know, I wrote a history of the 11th Corps. So I looked through a lot of the letters, a lot of the diaries, a lot of the things, memoirs later that people left. And it was kind of interesting. When troops from the East and troops from the West met, for example, when Sherman's army met the Army of the Potomac, or Terry's army from Charleston later in the war, they really didn't like each other very, very much. The Easterners thought the Westerners didn't have very much military discipline. The Westerners thought the Easterners were too starch and stiff. So there was kind of a common wariness of each other to begin with. Going specifically to your question, though, one of the things I noticed was that initially there was this same kind of feeling out of each other. The Eastern troops thought the Westerners didn't have very much discipline. The Westerners, on a couple of occasions, said, well, these people didn't do very well. Now they're coming out to help us. We don't expect much. But what was really interesting was that after Wauhatchie and after Chattanooga, Grant himself wrote a letter of thanks to Howard, praising how well his 11th Corps had behaved. After that and after the march to and from Knoxville, Sherman wrote a letter to Howard, praising how well his troops had behaved. And throughout their service under Sherman, even though there really wasn't any 11th Corps anymore, they were now part of the 20th, they continued to receive praise. So it's amazing that once the 11th Corps made it west, and once they were actually involved in action, some of the leading generals that they served under had nothing but complimentary terms for them. So I think once they got away from the Army of the Potomac, it was probably good for their morale as well to be appreciated. I like to joke that on the train ride out toward Chattanooga, some of the soldiers commented that the train had been prepared so quickly that some of the manure from the cattle that had been used to transport was still there. So there must have been some amazing medicinal properties in that manure, because by the time they got to Chattanooga, all of a sudden they turned into pretty good soldiers.
Very good. And then my second question was, it revolves around the image of Karl Vickesburg. We have two images in our collection showing soldiers from the 26th Wisconsin standing in front of the very same backdrop that Vickesburg is standing in front of in that picture. In the lower, I guess, left-hand corner, as you look at the picture, you see a tent with 26th Sigel Regiment on the tent. There's some other adornment on the backdrop there. Have you encountered other images like that? And in your research, I've always wondered where those pictures were taken, if you've been able to identify the location of where those images and when those images were taken.
Well, I'm almost positive that they were taken in Milwaukee before the regiment marched off. There are several photographs that have pretty much the same background, so quite obviously it was taken in a photographer's studio. There were a few, I don't know, 2, 3, maybe 4 letters from soldiers or diary entries that mention them getting their photo taken during the course of the war. But since there are so many of these and they all have pretty much the same background, I'm assuming they were all taken before they went off to war. The regiment trained outside of Milwaukee, so undoubtedly they were taken in one of the Milwaukee photographic studios, probably a German one, I imagine. I'm not sure if I ever identified which one or not, but I'll be happy to look through my notes and see if I can find any reference to it.
Thanks, that'd be really helpful. The one soldier we have that's identified of the two with that same backdrop, his name was John Held. He was a Cooper from Racine. The family donated it to the museum. The other man I haven't been able to pin down. We've kind of narrowed down who we think it is, but again, same backdrop, and we use that image a lot here when we're talking to groups or students, and that, you know, the subject matter of the photograph, the soldier itself is very important. The uniform, his pose, his posture, any weaponry that they may hold. But sometimes the real importance of a photograph, you have to even look deeper into the backdrop. It can tell you so much about the individual soldier, the regiment, where it was taken, just exactly as you described.
Yeah. Sometimes a lot of these are really formal portraits, and in that day and age, photography was so and unique that people usually stood in pretty formal poses for their portrait. But occasionally you'll get somebody who's obviously decided to make it rather informal, sometimes even in odd positions and so forth. So it's kind of interesting to look at these things. If you send me a copy of the unidentified photo, I'll be glad to match it up with ones that I have and see if I can offer at least an opinion for you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that offer, and then also for doing the program with us today. we'll look forward to having you back here in person or virtually in the future to support the museum. Your programs are always really great and great interest to our visitors and our members. So thank you so much for coming out today and doing this for us.
Thanks again, Doug. Thanks for the invitation, and I wish you every luck with your continuing series. Take care.
Bye-bye.